Welcome, everyone, to our virtual talk today, hosted by the China Institute at the University of Alberta. My name is Jia Wang. I'm the interim director of the China Institute. I'm so delighted that Professor Reza Hasmas has kindly agreed to share key findings from his highly anticipated new research project that examines the efficacy of international organizations naming and shaming China on alleged human rights violations. The University of Alberta acknowledges that we're located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Professor Hasmas' presentation today will be followed by Q&A. We encourage our audience members to submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Questions can be submitted at any time, but we'll try to address them after the presentation. I'm so delighted to introduce our featured speaker today, Professor Reza Hasmas. He's a full professor at the Political Science Department at the University of Alberta, and he's also an academic advisor of the China Institute. He received his PhD from Cambridge University. A true international scholar, he has previously held faculty positions at the universities of Toronto, Melbourne, and Oxford, and has worked for think tanks, consultancies, development agencies, and NGOs in the United States, Canada, Australia, UK, and China. His award-winning research examines how the behavior of emerging Chinese state and non-state actors potentially affect salient theories, practices, and assumptions in international affairs. Without further ado, Reza, the virtual floor is yours for your presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for Jia and her team for organizing this webinar. I'm just going to share my screen with you before I commence the conversation we're going to have today on naming and shaming China on human rights. Just bear with me while I just move these icons around. Brilliant. So this is a really interesting project that I've literally finished writing up a few hours ago, to be very frank. It's something that's been 2 decades in the making. A lot of the work I've been doing, since the early 2000s is looking at how social organizations operate in China. I've also looked at very sensitive issues on China, looking at ethnicity and rights and the sort of understanding of how China operates itself in terms of human rights framework. And over the years, I've often tried to imagine and try to analyze and examine whether or not international pressure on China actually works. And so in this particular paper, in this particular study in general, I'm trying to understand, does naming and shaming as a tactic actually change or shifts China's human rights sort of work? And so I'm going to detail it to you in a much more academic fashion, and I'll give you some data, I'll illustrate some regressions, then I'll try to talk about the implications and then talk about strategies China could potentially take to combat the naming and shaming. And then perhaps we can open up to the floor to see any questions you may have. So let me start off by suggesting this. Naming and shaming is a popular strategy employed by human rights organizations to improve the human rights conditions in a target nation. So naming and shaming, it's really been theorized as a rhetorical coercion, so to speak. It's employing sort of rhetoric to affect change through global shame, rather than hard forms of coercion or persuasion, such as, for example, military intervention or economic sanctions, which has been quite in vogue over the last couple of months. In most jurisdictions, naming and shaming has not been very effective overall. In fact, if you look at studies in Latin America, naming and shaming was only found to be most effective in targeted nations which had a high dependency on foreign aid. And that's not necessarily the reality we see in the Chinese context. there's very little work out there that actually examines whether or not naming and shaming actually can be used as an effective strategy in the Chinese context. The assumption has been is that, well, it has worked in other jurisdictions, but where it has worked is when, as I suggested from other studies, it's where there's a high dependency on foreign aid. So it's coupled with other strategies beyond naming and shaming. And in fact, if you want to look at the prevailing sort of literature out there, it suggests that naming and shaming from NGOs and religious organizations have the strongest effect, while international governmental organizations such as the UN Human Rights Council had the weakest effect. And in fact, the effects of naming and shaming was most strong when it came from multiple sources. So this is sort of the background sort of work in terms of trying to understand, does naming and shaming China on human rights work? So I'll give you a few words about the methodological strategy. Basically, I collected all the publicly available human rights reports pertaining to China from 3 different human rights-based organizations between 1991 and 2021. So we have a 30-year kind of sample there. The 3 organizations were Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Office of United Nations Human Rights Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as their sort of interrelated sort of organization within the UN system, the UN Human Rights Council. Amnesty International has been quite active on campuses, so many of you might be aware of them, whereby they're an international NGO headquartered in London, UK. Its stated mission goal is to, quote, ensure every person enjoys all the human rights enshrined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and other human rights instruments. It aims to accomplish this by undertaking research and action focused on preventing and ending grave abuses of these rights. Then we have Human Rights Watch, which is a New York City-based organization, which, quote, uses traditional on-the-ground fact-finding with new technologies and innovative advocacy to do research and advocacy on economic, social, cultural, political, and civil human rights. Finally, we have the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Human Rights Council, which is a leading intergovernmental agency which looks at the full range of human rights and freedoms set out in the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights. And as an organization, they aim to promote, protect, empower, and assist governments in injecting human rights sort of perspective into all UN programs. So effectively, I took all the publicly available sort of documents pertaining to China from these organizations and collected it into a sort of a database to analyze the sort of strategies that's used. Now, there's, if you get into greater depth in terms of how Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the UN system actually utilize naming and shaming strategies, well, there's some slight variations. So Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch generally uses press releases intended for the media and the general public's consumption. They might have more detailed background reports based on more in-depth human rights investigations. Amnesty International in particular also pursues urgent action campaigns, and they generally get their members to write letters to an offending government. In the United Nations Human Rights Council, the process for naming and shaming, it's much more process-driven. It has 4 possible outcomes. So first, if there's an alleged abuse, the target nation's abuses are discussed in the private session and does not continue. There might be confidential considerations may continue. There might be a mild sanction is issued, such as a critical statement with limited publication, or they pass a public resolution condemning the abuses. So this gives you sort of a background behind the sort of the internal strategies that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations HRC does when it comes to naming and shaming strategies. So as I said, I collected all the available information that's publicly accessible over the last 30 years from 1991 to 2021. And here we can see the total number of human rights reports on China per annum during this time period. What's really interesting when you look at this chart is from 2008 onwards, we see an increase in terms of the human rights reports. And if we look at 2013 in particular, well, rather 2008 is when China hosted the International Olympic Committee's Summer Games. So there was greater attention on China. But by 2012, 2013, we see Xi Jinping increasing, actually getting power. So the new sort of regime at this stage. So under the Xi Jinping era, there's been more human rights reports by these three agencies than ever beforehand since in the 20th and 21st century. So it's really interesting to see that these reports are increasing in scale and scope. And in fact, what we see here is the total combined reports from the three organizations spanning 1991 and 2021. If you really want to get really specific, Human Rights Watch and the United Nations Human Rights Watch was 1991 to 2020. The United Nations system was 2013 to 2020. Those were where we saw an abundance of these sort of reports on China's human rights, alleged human rights abuses. Now, what's really fascinating is this aggregating these kinds of reports by not only theme, but also by affected persons. So here we can see the general themes that are conducive to these reports that's being issued by these three organizations. Generally speaking, they are rights-based kinds of reports, that is political and civil rights-based kinds of alleged abuses. We see that there is discrimination. We see that there's economic discrimination. We see that generally seems to be the major kinds of reports on an annual basis, by a thematic basis, that is. I should mention that these themes are self-reported. And so it's actually coded by the United Nations, these particular themes. And what we ended up doing is just coding it in terms of the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch sort of themes as well into the UN sort of themes. So we can really see distinctive themes, particularly in the 2010s, as I mentioned. Now, there's also by affected persons. What we see is that activists are being targeted more in terms of human rights reports. We see that there's political sort of persecution, perhaps. We see that the least reports are generally looking at children. It's not there as much. Drug use is not so much. We see, for example, here that vulnerable individuals are increasing in scale and scope, ethnic minorities, particularly among Xinjiang. So we can really see how the nature of China's human rights, sort of alleged human rights reports, has shifted and been in the 2010s based on this data here. Now, this is not necessarily, the purpose is really to try to understand, is putting pressure on China working? So on the one hand, I've collected all the data, looking at Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations, looking at the type of reports on alleged human rights abuses, looking at the affected persons. And what we can see here is that all three human rights organizations have maintained a concerted effort to both name China's alleged human rights violations and also to shame them internationally through awareness campaigns and aimed at highlighting these alleged abuses. So what these naming and shaming efforts really do is that they put pressure, at least in theory, on China in a myriad of uncountable ways. So, for example, it can be through a potential loss of international investment. It can be through negative media coverage. It can be further garnering of negative international reputation concerning human rights. So, for example, when we're looking at the alleged abuses in Xinjiang, there's been a lot of international investment that China's lost by virtue of these alleged abuses in the Xinjiang area. So, how to examine whether or not this is effective? To test the effect, really, of the reports on human rights in China. So we've collected the reports. I've given you the disaggregation of those reports. The next way to actually test to see if there's any causal relationship, I used Our World in Data sort of project data. This is an Oxford University's data set. And what they have here is that they have 6 major indices looking at human rights score, economic freedom, political competition, human rights violations, democracy participation and competition, and freedom of press. So effectively what I'm trying to do here is test those indices and that sort of data set that they have there on the basis of the sort of reports to see if there's any demonstrable sort of shifts in China's behavior. So amongst the indices tested, human rights score was statistically significant, which is great news because it tells us we have a sort of a score that we can utilize to try and understand whether or not these reports actually play a role to some extent in changing China's human rights score. Just for academic reasons, the economic freedom score was not statistically significant. Human rights violations, democracy participation, competition, and freedom of press did not have enough pre or post-treatment data. Political competition did not have much diverse data to afford meaningful causal analysis. But again, as I suggested to you, the human rights score was statistically significant, which makes it a great sort of comparator to try and understand how these reports actually might play a role in testing the human rights score. So I'm going to give you a series of charts. I'm going to give you a series of regressions. If you're not statistically inclined, not to worry. I'll after I go through a few of these charts, I will try to explain to you the implications and what they really mean. So the first chart I'm going to look at is the causal effect of organizations' reports on China's human rights score. Effectively, what this chart is suggesting is that the United Nations on their reports have a greater causal effect on China's human rights score. And you can see that it's a gross variation compared to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. So what this suggests here is that the United Nations, followed by Human Rights Watch, and followed by the combined element, or rather, sorry, the United Nations, then combined and Human Rights Watch, all play a statistically significant sort of role in terms of changing the perception. But as you can see, the gross majority of the United Nations work does play a role in affecting China's human rights score. And I'm going to explain why that's the case as we continue this presentation. Amnesty International was not statistically significant. So that was something that had to be dealt with, and I'll discuss that a bit more in a moment. In fact, let me show you the Amnesty International effect on China's human rights score. So although Amnesty International appears to have caused a positive effect, this effect is not statistically significant, as I mentioned, when considering the entire post-intervention period as a whole. So individual days or shorter stretches within the intervening period may, of course, still have a significant effect whenever the lower limit of the impact time series was above zero. This apparent effect could be the result of random fluctuations that are unrelated to the intervention. This is often the case when the intervention period is very long and includes much of the time when the effect is already worn off. And so, what we see here is that Amnesty International may not have had a major effect that's statistically significant. So that's effectively what this graph is illustrating here. When we look at Human Rights Watch, we see that the individual data points during the post-intervention period, the response variable had an overall value of 51.67. By contrast, if the intervention did not take place, we would expect a sum of 43.35. In other words, that's a fancy way of suggesting to you that Human Rights Watch had about a 19-20%, sorry, the exact figure was 19% sort of effect on China's human rights score. And then if we go to the United Nations, we see here the best effect is from the UN system, where there is a approximate 124% change. That's a significant change here on China's human rights score. And finally, the combined effect here, we see that the response variable had an overall value of 54.28. By contrast, if there was no intervention among all three parties, that is Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, we would expect a score of 44.70. So, in relative terms, the response variable showed an increase of 21%. Now, again, if you're not statistically inclined, this may be seen as fancy charts, but it doesn't tell you much. There's a few takeaways here. This is what I can suggest to you. There's a few takeaways we can have from all of this. Foremost, treatment for the United Nations is the most successful. That's the first takeaway from the data. And why that's important is as follows. When we look at human rights in China, or rather when we look at human rights in general, we often forget that there's actually two different discourses on human rights that's predominant. It's been predominant in the latter part of the 20th century and in the early 21st century. That is, there's an International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and there's an International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The United Nations, as an organization, does practice both economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights. So it may suggest one of the reasons why the United Nations has been most successful in actually influencing China's human rights record. But we can dig a bit deeper into that as well. China has been successful as well at avoiding being condemned by the United Nations Human Rights Council's public resolutions because it is a member of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And it's also proposed alternative models of human rights, less focus on civil and political rights and more so on economic, social, and cultural rights, where it's a party to the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and it's not a party to the Civil and Political Convention. So put differently, what we do find is that China does try to promote conceptualizing human rights in local contexts. Which many critics have argued that it weakens human rights, or at least civil and political rights, and the UNHRC's sort of work. Now, so the UN has been the most successful based on the data. The combined effect on all treatments is the next successful. That's just another way of suggesting when you combine Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, when you find that all three organizations true pressure China, that's the second most successful. The third most successful is Human Rights Watch, and the least successful is Amnesty International. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, they do rely a lot on local NGOs' presence to be more, that leads to more campaigning and to more engagement. For those of you who might be aware of the Chinese context, international NGOs, particularly rights-based NGOs, have a very difficult time operating in China at this stage. Both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have a difficult time relying on local human rights organizations who they partner with, or even having a presence in the mainland. So, and this can potentially contribute to the fact why those two organizations are not as successful. It's simply because of, one, they are more civil and political rights based rather than economic, social, and cultural rights. And two, because they don't have much of a local presence as they do in other jurisdictions, which makes them more effective. Now, there is some methodological concerns. One of that being is that the human rights score is not without controversy, in terms of its methodology. It is possible that China's human rights score shifted during the treatment period, which has no which has no connection to human rights reports. So maybe economic development, local resistance, a rising middle class, more international investment. So they can all play a role, but statistically speaking, the data does show that there is a good correlation between the United Nations and combined treatments, and Human Rights Watch in particular as statistically significant to the human rights score. Now, the last thing I want to mention is looking at potential countering strategies by China. And the reason why I do this is that it allows us to understand what strategies China might use to combat potential human rights allegations. And if you're thinking even further ahead, strategies that international organizations can do in retort to counteract their counter strategies, so to speak. So there are rhetorical methods a targeted state can use to deny, deflect, or otherwise counter naming and shaming allegations on the international stage. There is, for instance, the reverse rhetorical entrapment response to naming and shaming. And we saw this being done in the United States response to Human Rights Watch's shaming of torture interrogation methods post 9/11. And what you saw is that the US administration at the time responded with a framing that its methods were justified to battle the war on terror. And we see China has used this sort of reverse rhetorical entrapment response when it comes to Xinjiang, whereby it's tried to link the rise of ethnic tensions in the region to potential terrorism. So it was a playbook that was used by the United States, in fact, post 9/11. And we can utilize this as a reverse rhetorical entrapment response. So in many respects, it is something that you're using a consequentialist argument about whether or not methods can be effective and not simply whether the torture was a human rights violation effectively. So we have to be mindful that China is utilizing a response such as this. Another rhetorical method can be the implication contest. And in the case of Human Rights Watch, for example, they were naming and shaming the Israeli Defense Force during the Lebanon War and the Gaza War. And when accused of violating international humanitarian law, the Israeli Defense Force did not argue against the credibility or applicability of international humanitarian law, but rather utilized abstract vagaries to argue that its tactics were not excessive according to international humanitarian law. And in turn, Human Rights Watch was counter-shamed by the Israeli Defense Force. And they actually employed IDF NGOs such as NGO Monitor to their assistance. So, this is something that if China is named and shamed in this respect, they can do an implication contest kind of strategy. There's some other strategies that China can use to counter some of the naming and shaming out there. So for instance, the naming and shaming of political rights abuses tends to lead targeted states to substitute the name abuses for other more violent abuses. So this is what's called a repression substitution hypothesis. So I'll give you an example. If there was killing, if there was a capital punishment, for example, when shamed for imprisonment or torture, while the less violent imprisonment and disappearance were also significant substitutes for torture. In other words, what we do find is that when you name and shame political rights abuses, it can actually lead to other abuses, much more violent abuses. And the evidence say that from other jurisdictions that we do see this as a reality. So it is possible that China may stop its abuses on X, but actually do something much more harmful in Y as a substitution. Finally, another technique that China can utilize, it can avoid the adverse consequences of being shamed by simply pursuing new international relationships with like-minded nation states. So that way it's not being named and shamed. The effects of the naming and shaming can actually be contained by virtue of having greater alliances and greater sorts of allegiances to other like-minded nation states, whether there'll be Russia, for example, which has made the headlines today. This is something that China can do to potentially counteract the naming and shaming strategies that international organizations utilized. So at the end of the day, the takeaway from this talk is this. When it comes to naming and shaming in China, generally speaking, economic, social, and cultural rights as a human right tends to have the best outcomes. And so that's why we see the United Nations as an entity has the best possible outcomes, whereby if you're naming and shaming China in terms of civil and political rights, generally speaking, there's not as much influence that global actors have in terms of their influence on China in this respect. Finally, there are issues in China that are more susceptible to naming and shaming because it's a low cost to the regime. For example, if you name and shame China in terms of the environment, they are more statistically likely to be responsive to that because it's seen as a much more safer sort of topic area than, say, civil and political rights oriented sort of naming and shaming tactics. So that's the sort of the key takeaways that the study illustrates. And I've done it both through statistical data, as I've illustrated, but also through understanding the sort of strategies that other nations have utilized to counteract naming and shaming strategies. So let me end the presentation there.